On the morning of February 10, 1990, Las Cruces, New Mexico was doing what it always did. Waking up slowly, the desert air was cold, the streets were quiet. The city hadn't yet shaken off the night. Inside Pro Bowl West Bowling Alley, the lights were already on. The building smelled like coffee, cleaner, and old carpet. The sound of pins echoed faintly as the lanes warmed up. Behind the counter stood 71-year-old Jerry Hawkins, a man who had spent most of his life inside bowling alleys just like this one. Jerry wasn't flashy, he wasn't reckless, he was routine. Routine is important to understand here, because nothing about that morning felt out of routine. His daughter-in-law, 26-year-old Stephanie Hawkins, was helping behind the counter. She was young, friendly, and trusted. Customers knew her, kids liked her. She had a life ahead of her that ended inside that building less than an hour later. A small group of customers drifted in. A retired couple, a young woman with her toddler, a college student. Locals who had done this exact thing dozens of times before. They didn't know each other well, but they shared something important. They believed they were safe. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the front doors opened. Two men walked in. No rush, no shouting. Dark clothing, ski masks, gloves. Immediately, the tone of the room changed. This wasn't a robbery in the traditional sense. There was no yelling, no chaos at first. The gunmen took control quickly. People were ordered to the floor. Others were forced behind the counter and toward the office. Witnesses later said the men spoke calmly, like this was something they had rehearsed. And that's when the killing began. Victims were shot at close range, execution style. This wasn't spray and pray violence. This was personal distance violence, the kind where you look at someone before pulling the trigger. One victim was shot multiple times. Another survivor later described hearing begging, promises, pleas. It didn't matter. At some point during the massacre, one of the gunmen ran out of ammunition. Instead of panicking, he walked out of the building. He went to the car. He got more bullets. He came back inside. That detail alone tells investigators almost everything about the psychology of the killers. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't emotional. This was committed. By the time the gunfire stopped, 7 people were dead. Jerry Hawkins, Stephanie Hawkins, several customers who had done nothing but show up early on a Saturday morning. 4 people survived. One of them was a 2-year-old girl. She had been shot twice, once in the arm, once in the torso. She survived because the bullet paths missed anything vital. Another survivor lay bleeding on the floor, pretending to be dead while listening to the gunmen talk to each other nearby. The killers then attempted to set the bowling alley on fire. The fire failed, and then they left. No witnesses outside, no recorded license plate, no trail. They disappeared. When police arrived, the scene felt unreal. Bowling shoes scattered across the floor, coffee still warm, blood everywhere. Investigators immediately understood something chilling. This wasn't random. This wasn't panic. This was intentional. The first working theory was robbery, but the deeper investigators looked, the less sense that made. Robbers want speed. These men stayed. They reloaded. They finished. So detectives began asking the question that still haunts this case. Who was the real target? Suspect theory. The business hit. Jerry Hawkins became the first focal point. He owned the bowling alley. He handled cash. He had insurance policies. Investigators examined his finances in detail. They found no massive debts, no financial collapse, no desperate situations. His insurance policies were standard, no suspicious increases, no recent changes. Employees were interviewed, competitors were questioned, nothing, no threats, no known disputes, no signs of extortion. And here's what matters. If this was a hit meant for Jerry Hawkins, it was one of the sloppiest hits imaginable. Professional hits are clean, fast, targeted. This was none of that. 7 people were executed, including women and a child. That kind of collateral damage doesn't align with professional crime, which pushes investigators toward another possibility. Suspect theory. Verse 2. The wrong place. Almost immediately, rumors began circulating. What if the wrong bowling alley was targeted? Las Cruces wasn't a major crime hub, but it wasn't isolated either. Interstate routes ran nearby. People passed through. What if someone believed a different person would be there that morning? What if the real target never showed up? This theory explains the brutality. It explains the frustration. It explains why no one was spared. But it raises another question. If this was a mistake, why didn't the killers stop? Why reload? Why continue once it was clear the intended target wasn't present? Mistakes usually cause hesitation. These men never hesitated. Suspect theory. There are 3 drug connections. This theory has lingered for decades, but it's important to separate rumor from fact. Investigators found no evidence that Jerry Hawkins or Stephanie Hawkins were involved in drug trafficking. None. No financial indicators, no known associations, no surveillance flags. However, Las Cruces sat near trafficking corridors. Could the bowling alley have been a meeting place, a drop point? There is no proof, and again, the violence doesn't match. Drug hits are about silence. This was loud, messy, public. Suspect theory. Then before, the survivor problem. This is one of the darkest parts of the case. 4 people survived. The killers had every opportunity to finish them off. They didn't. Why? Some investigators believe the shooters believed everyone was dead. Others think something stopped them. But survivors complicate a case. Survivors remember voices, mannerisms, movements, and survivors age. Their memories evolve. Some details sharpen, others fade. Over the years, investigators re-interviewed survivors multiple times. No breakthrough, no identification, no recognition. Which brings us to the most unsettling theory of all. Suspect theory. Figure 5. Ordinary men. What if these weren't criminals in the traditional sense? What if they weren't gang members or professionals? What if they were just men? Men with jobs, men with families, men who went back to normal life afterward. Investigators have always believed there was a leader, not officially, not on paper. But behavior tells stories. Paperwork never will. Inside the bowling alley, one of the gunmen consistently appeared more controlled, more directive. Survivors recalled one voice giving instructions while the other followed. That detail matters. In violent crimes involving more than one offender, roles almost always emerge. One person plans, one executes, one escalates, one follows. The organizer is rarely the loudest. They're calm, decisive. They've already imagined the outcome. Psychologically, the organizer fits a specific profile. This is someone who plans ahead, someone who rehearses scenarios mentally, someone who believes they are justified, maybe even necessary. The organizer likely selected the location, the timing, and the weapons, not because they were ideal, but because they were sufficient. The ski masks weren't for intimidation, they were for anonymity. The gloves weren't panic-driven, they were premeditated. This suggests a person familiar with criminal risk, but not necessarily a lifelong criminal. More likely, someone who had crossed a line slowly. Grievance is the key. Organizers don't kill randomly. They kill to correct something they believe is wrong, a perceived betrayal, a financial loss, a humiliation that festered. What's unsettling is that investigators never found a grievance connected to the victims, which means the grievance may not have been obvious. It could have been imagined. Organizers are often narcissistic in a quiet way. They don't crave attention, but they do crave control. The bowling alley wasn't chosen for chaos. It was chosen because it was manageable, contained, predictable. The organizer likely returned to normal life afterward, not with guilt, but with relief. The plan was completed. And people like this rarely talk. Every organizer needs someone willing to pull the trigger. The enforcer is different, less controlled, more reactive, often younger, or emotionally dependent on the organizer. This is the person who fires more shots, the person who may panic slightly, but keeps going because stopping feels worse. The enforcer doesn't necessarily understand the full motive. They understand loyalty, fear, obligation. This profile fits someone who felt they had something to prove, someone who needed validation. The act of reloading is critical here. That moment could have been a breaking point, but it wasn't, which means the enforcer either trusted the organizer completely or feared the consequences of stopping. Enforcers often experience delayed psychological fallout, nightmares, substance abuse, erratic behavior. If this person ever cracked, it likely happened privately. They may have confessed to someone indirectly, a spouse, a friend, a drinking buddy, and those confessions may have been dismissed as exaggeration or dark humor, because people don't want to believe someone they know could do something like this. This crime does not suggest strangers who met casually. Their coordination was too smooth. Their silence afterward was too complete. This was a relationship built on trust or coercion, possibly family, possibly lifelong friends, possibly one person holding leverage over the other. One theory investigators quietly considered was that one offender couldn't afford to talk without incriminating themselves in something else, another crime, another secret. That kind of mutual destruction creates silence. The lack of post-crime communication, no bragging, no taunting, suggests both men understood the stakes immediately. They didn't see this as a rush. They saw it as a burden to carry. Random violence is messy. This wasn't. The killers controlled the room. They separated victims. They didn't flee at the first sign of resistance. They attempted arson afterward, not impulsively, but methodically. Random killers seek sensation. These men sought completion. That points to purpose. But purpose without an obvious motive is rare, which leads to a chilling possibility. The motive may have died with the victims. If someone believed a person inside that building had wronged them, but that belief was mistaken, then the crime becomes permanently untethered from logic. A misremembered face, a false assumption, a rumor treated as truth. In psychology, this is called moral certainty. When someone becomes so convinced they are right, evidence stops mattering. That mindset can produce extraordinary violence without remorse. Most criminals fail in the aftermath. They talk, they change behavior, they self-destruct. These men didn't, which suggests experience with compartmentalization. They knew how to separate actions from identity. They likely returned to structured lives, jobs with routine, roles with authority, relationships where silence was normal. If either man had been chaotic or unstable long-term, the case likely would have cracked. It didn't, which implies discipline, and discipline doesn't come from nowhere. The most unsettling theory isn't that the killers escaped. It's that they were never suspected. They may have been interviewed and dismissed. They may have stood behind police tape. They may have attended funerals. They may have lived quietly for decades. Because crimes like this don't end. They just go dormant, and someone out there still knows exactly what happened inside that bowling alley. They remember reloading that gun. They remember the sound, and until they speak, this case remains open. The calm behavior, the lack of panic, the discipline. That kind of control often comes from people who believe they are justified, people who believe they are finishing something. This theory suggests something deeply personal motivated the attack, but personal to whom? And that's where the case collapses. Because no one in that bowling alley had enemies capable of this, which leaves only one conclusion. Someone involved has never been identified. Someone who blended back into society so completely that no one ever suspected them. No arrests, no convictions, no justice. The Las Cruces bowling alley massacre remains unsolved. 7 lives erased in minutes, and more than 3 decades later, someone still knows the truth. Someone still remembers that morning, and until that person speaks, this case remains one of the most disturbing unanswered questions in American crime history. How this case slipped away. When investigators arrived at Pro Bowl West Bowling Alley, they were not unprepared. They were overwhelmed. 7 people dead, 4 survivors, a public space, 2 unknown attackers, limited forensic tools. And from the very beginning, the case was fighting gravity. Because crimes like this demand speed, clarity, and resources that small departments rarely have all at once. The first failure wasn't incompetence, it was scale. Las Cruces in 1990 was not equipped for a mass execution crime scene of this magnitude. Evidence collection was rushed, not carelessly but urgently. The building was large. Blood spatter was everywhere. Victims were moved quickly for medical treatment, which saved lives but altered the scene. That trade-off matters. Every minute after a shooting like this, evidence degrades, footprints overlap, shell casings get kicked, fingerprints smear. And in 1990, forensic preservation protocols were nowhere near what they are today. The second failure was time. The killers left no immediate trail, no known witnesses outside, no license plate, no clear direction of escape. Roadblocks were limited. Regional coordination took time. By the time a perimeter could have mattered, the gunmen were already gone. Then came the third failure. Robbery became the default explanation, not because it fit perfectly, but because it fit enough. Money was taken, weapons were used, a business was targeted. Once a case narrative settles early, it shapes everything that follows. Witness interviews, suspect prioritization. What evidence is considered relevant and what isn't. Investigators did explore other angles, but robbery lingered in the background as the organizing theory, even as evidence quietly contradicted it. The fourth failure was forensic timing. This crime happened at the worst possible moment in criminal investigation history. DNA technology existed, but it was primitive. Touch DNA wasn't viable. Partial samples were often unusable. Databases were tiny or non-existent. Any DNA recovered had nowhere meaningful to go. Fingerprints were partial. Ballistics linked weapons, but not people. Fire damage further complicated analysis. Today, this would be a cold case goldmine. In 1990, it was a dead end. The fifth failure was witness fragility. Survivors were traumatized. Some were children. One was a toddler. Trauma doesn't preserve memory, it distorts it. Descriptions changed slightly over time, details blurred, voices remembered without faces, and defense attorneys know this. Even if suspects had been identified years later, the reliability of eyewitness testimony would have been aggressively challenged. That reality discouraged risk. The sixth failure was resource exhaustion. As weeks turned into months, leads dried up. Investigators chased tips that went nowhere. Rumors collapsed under scrutiny. Informants had nothing concrete. Cases like this require sustained pressure, years of dedicated manpower. Instead, detectives were reassigned. New cases came in. Budgets tightened. The massacre never stopped haunting the department, but it stopped being the only priority. The seventh and most damaging failure was absence of leverage. There were no arrests to flip, no informants with bargaining power, no co-conspirator breaking ranks. 2 men committed this crime. Both stayed silent. Without pressure, silence wins. And once time passes, silence hardens into permanence. The final failure wasn't procedural, it was cultural. In 1990, law enforcement still believed mass killers wanted to be known, that they would brag, that they would escalate, that they would slip. These men didn't. They understood something investigators didn't yet fully appreciate. That anonymity is power. By staying quiet, by blending in, by never reoffending publicly, they removed themselves from the narrative entirely, and the system had no answer for that. This case didn't fail because police didn't care. It failed because it landed at the intersection of limited technology, early assumptions, resource strain, and offenders who understood restraint. By the time modern tools caught up, the trail was cold, the witnesses were older, the killers were ghosts, and the truth may have already died with them. There are crimes that end with handcuffs. There are crimes that end with courtrooms and verdicts and sentences that try to turn chaos into something manageable. And then there are crimes like this, crimes that never end because nothing was taken back. No explanation was given. No justice arrived to close the door. The Las Cruces bowling alley massacre doesn't live in police files anymore. It lives in memory, in the sound of bowling pins that never fell again. In a building where laughter was replaced with silence, in the lives of people who survived and carried something invisible out with them. We like to believe that violence announces itself, that danger looks like danger, that killers are easy to spot. But the men who walked into Pro Bowl West didn't look like monsters. They looked prepared. They looked ordinary enough to walk back into the world and disappear. And that's the part that unsettles us most. Not the blood, not even the brutality, but the restraint. Because restraint suggests intention, and intention suggests belief. Somewhere, two people decided that what they were about to do made sense, that it was necessary, that it was justified. And once that decision was made, the lives inside that bowling alley became secondary to an idea. That idea died with the victims. Or worse, it lived on. We often ask the wrong question. We ask, who did this? But the more disturbing question is, how did they live with it afterward? Because people who commit spontaneous violence usually unravel. They confess, they self-destruct, they crave release. These men didn't. They went quiet. Silence became their alibi, and silence worked. Years passed. Children grew up. Survivors aged. The world moved forward, but nothing replaced what was lost. 7 people were erased from ordinary life. They didn't choose history. History chose them, and then forgot them. When a crime goes unsolved for decades, something subtle happens. The absence of answers begins to feel normal. We stop expecting resolution. We stop demanding it. We adapt to not knowing. And in doing so, we let uncertainty become part of the landscape. That's not justice failing. That's memory failing. Because justice depends on pressure, and pressure fades. What remains is a quiet agreement between the living and the unknown. An agreement that some things will never be explained, some people will never be held accountable, and some stories will never have an ending. But silence isn't neutral. Silence protects someone. It always does. Somewhere, someone heard about this case and felt something tighten in their chest. Somewhere, someone remembered that morning with perfect clarity. The sound, the smell, the moment they realized there was no turning back. And they said nothing. They carried it. They lived their life. They aged. They watched the world change. And the world never asked them to answer for it. That's the quiet terror at the heart of this story. Not that the killers escaped, but that they didn't need to run. They just waited, and time did the rest. We want to believe that evil burns bright, that it announces itself, that it leaves fingerprints we can always find. But sometimes evil doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers once, and then never speaks again. The bowling alley in Las Cruces no longer looks the way it did that morning. But the question still hangs in the air. If something like this can happen in a place built for joy, on a calm Sunday morning, and vanish into history without answers, what does that say about how fragile certainty really is? This case doesn't ask you to solve it. It asks you to sit with it, to accept that some truths aren't uncovered, they're buried, and sometimes they stay that way. Before you go, remember the names, not the headlines, because stories like this don't stay alive on their own. They survive because someone keeps watching, keeps listening, keeps refusing to let silence be the final word. This channel exists for the cases that never got answers, for the people who were reduced to footnotes, for the truths that were buried instead of solved. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe attention is a form of justice, then this is where you belong. Subscribe to stay with us, not for closure, not for easy endings, but to bear witness. Because when the world forgets, someone has to remember, and here we do.